The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton as a modest sedan pulled through the main gates. Behind the wheel sat Colonel Rebecca Becca Martinez, though nobody at this base would know that name or recognize the face that had commanded respect in war zones across 3 continents. Today, she wore the simple uniform of a new recruit, her silver hair hidden beneath a standard-issue cap, her decorated chest bare of the medals that told the story of 35 years of distinguished service. This wasn't just any assignment. This was Operation Mirror, a classified investigation ordered directly from the Pentagon after months of disturbing reports had filtered up through the chain of command. Allegations of systemic discrimination, abuse of power, and the deliberate targeting of female recruits had reached the highest levels of military leadership. But these weren't just complaints about tough training or military discipline. These were accusations of harassment, humiliation, and the kind of toxic culture that the modern military was supposed to have left behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Department of Defense had tried the usual channels. Official inspections had been announced weeks in advance, giving plenty of time for any questionable practices to be temporarily suspended. Investigators had interviewed personnel, but in the rigid hierarchy of military life, few were willing to speak openly about their superiors. The truth remained elusive, hidden behind a wall of military protocol and fear of retaliation. That's when General Patricia Hayes, one of only a handful of 5-star generals in the U.S. military, made an unprecedented decision. If they couldn't get to the truth through conventional means, they would have to try something that had never been attempted before at this level. They would send in someone undercover. Not just any officer, but one of the most decorated colonels in the Army, someone whose own experiences as a woman in the military would give her the insight needed to understand what was really happening. Colonel Martinez had volunteered without hesitation. She had risen through the ranks during an era when women in combat roles were still fighting for basic recognition and respect. She had commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, had been wounded twice in the line of duty, and had earned the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. She had seen the military at its best and its worst, and she understood better than most how the culture of an institution could make or break the people within it. But this mission would be unlike anything she had ever undertaken. For the next 3 months, she would have to completely suppress her natural authority, her instincts as a leader, and her decades of experience. She would have to become what she had never truly been, a vulnerable recruit at the mercy of a system that might not have her best interests at heart. The transformation had begun months earlier. She had grown out her hair and changed her appearance as much as possible. Her military records had been temporarily sealed and replaced with a carefully constructed background that would pass even the most thorough screening. According to her new identity, she was Rebecca Martinez, a 45-year-old former civilian who had decided to enlist after her children had grown up and left home. Her fictional background included a series of mundane jobs and a late-in-life desire to serve her country, nothing that would suggest any military experience whatsoever. As she approached the reception area, Martinez felt a flutter of nerves that she hadn't experienced since her very first day of basic training over 30 decades ago. But this was different. Then, she had been an eager young woman ready to prove herself. Now, she was a seasoned officer preparing to witness and document whatever she might find, knowing that her findings could lead to courts-martials, career endings, and a fundamental restructuring of how this base operated. The sergeant at the reception desk barely looked up as she approached. Name, he asked, his tone suggesting that processing new recruits was the least interesting part of his day. Rebecca Martinez, she replied, keeping her voice steady and unremarkable. He flipped through a stack of papers, found her fictional file, and handed her a clipboard. Fill this out completely, don't leave anything blank. When you're done, take a seat and wait to be called. As she sat in the hard plastic chair, surrounded by genuine recruits who were decades younger, Martinez observed everything. The way the staff interacted with the new arrivals, the casual dismissiveness in some voices, the way certain recruits seemed to be singled out for particular attention. Already, she was beginning to see patterns that would become much clearer in the days to come. Her training as an investigator kicked in automatically. She noted the layout of the building, the security protocols, the faces of the personnel who would become central figures in her investigation. She watched how the young women around her were treated differently from the young men, how some staff members seemed to take particular pleasure in making certain recruits feel small and powerless. What she couldn't know, as she sat in that reception area, filling out forms under a false identity, was that in just a few weeks, everything would change. The careful balance of her undercover mission would be shattered by an encounter that nobody could have predicted, a moment when her true identity would be revealed in the most dramatic way possible, in front of witnesses who had spent weeks treating her as nothing more than an aging recruit who should have known better to try to join the army at her age. The first week at Fort Braxton shattered any illusions Colonel Martinez might have had about what she would face. Despite her decades of military experience, she found herself genuinely shocked by the culture that had taken root at this particular installation. This wasn't the tough but fair training she remembered from her own early days, nor was it the professional environment she had worked to create in her own commands. This was something else entirely, a system that seemed designed not to build soldiers, but to break spirits. The problem started immediately during in-processing. While male recruits were efficiently guided through the administrative requirements, the female recruits, including Martinez in her undercover role, found themselves subjected to a gauntlet of unnecessary delays, paperwork errors that had to be corrected multiple times, and a constant stream of subtle and not-so-subtle comments about their decision to join the military. Another one who thinks she can play soldier, muttered Sergeant First Class Morrison as Martinez handed over her medical records for the third time. Hope you're tougher than you look, Grandma. This isn't some corporate team-building exercise. Martinez bit back the response that came naturally after 35 years of command. Instead, she nodded meekly and apologized for the confusion with her paperwork, even though she knew perfectly well that the errors were being manufactured to create frustration and delay. The living quarters told another story entirely. While the male recruits were housed in recently renovated barracks with functioning heating, adequate bathroom facilities, and basic amenities, the female recruits, including Martinez in her undercover role, found themselves in a building that seemed to have been forgotten by the base maintenance crew. The hot water worked sporadically, several windows were cracked and sealed with tape, and the heating system produced more noise than warmth. "Welcome to paradise," said Lisa Chen, a 22-year-old recruit from California who had been assigned to the bunk next to Martinez. "I tried to put in a work order for the broken shower in our bathroom, but apparently there's a 6-month waiting list for non-essential repairs." Martinez learned quickly that non-essential seemed to describe anything that would improve the living conditions for female personnel. The men's barracks had received new mattresses, updated lighting, and fresh paint within the last year. The women's facilities looked like they hadn't been touched since the 1990s. But the physical conditions, while concerning, were nothing compared to the psychological warfare that masqueraded as training. During daily formations, female recruits were consistently called upon to perform tasks that were clearly designed to humiliate rather than instruct. They were assigned to clean bathrooms while male recruits practiced weapons handling. They were given kitchen duty during tactical training exercises. They were made to repeat basic physical exercises while their male counterparts moved on to advanced techniques. The message was clear and consistent. You don't belong here, you're not capable of real military service, and the sooner you quit, the better it will be for everyone. Staff Sergeant Williams seemed to take particular pleasure in singling out older female recruits. Martinez, he would bark during morning formation, since you're old enough to be everyone else's mother, maybe you should stick to maternal duties. Report to the mess hall for dish duty. Day after day, Martinez found herself scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, and performing menial tasks that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with sending a message about her place in the hierarchy. She watched how talented young women who had enlisted with genuine enthusiasm and ability were systematically undermined, their confidence eroded by constant criticism and exclusion from meaningful training opportunities. The psychological impact was devastating to witness. Sarah Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from Texas, who had scored in the top 10% on all her aptitude tests, began to doubt her abilities after being told repeatedly that she was too slow, too weak, and too emotional for military service. Jennifer Park, who held a degree in engineering and had enlisted with hopes of working in military technology, was assigned to laundry duty for 2 weeks straight while being told that complex thinking wasn't really her strong suit. Martinez documented everything in a secure digital journal that she updated each night after lights out. She noted names, dates, specific incidents, and patterns of behavior. She recorded conversations, described the live-in conditions, and tracked the systematic ways that female recruits were being set up for failure. But documentation was only part of her mission. She also had to survive the psychological assault without breaking character. Every day brought new challenges to her ability to remain passive in the face of injustice. When she saw a young recruit crying in the bathroom after being publicly humiliated during a training exercise, every instinct told her to intervene as the commanding officer she was. Instead, she had to comfort the young woman as a fellow recruit, offering quiet support while burning with rage at what she was witnessing. The most difficult moments came during the evening hours, when the female recruits would gather informally to support each other through what was becoming clear was a deliberately hostile environment. These young women, smart, capable, and dedicated, would share their experiences of being excluded, belittled, and systematically undermined. They spoke in whispers about considering quitting, about feeling like failures, about wondering if they had made a terrible mistake in thinking they could serve their country in uniform. "Maybe they're right," Lisa Chen said one evening, her voice barely audible in the darkness of the barracks. "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this. I used to think I was strong, but I can't even make it through a week without crying." It was all Martinez could do not to reveal herself in that moment, not to tell these remarkable young women that the problem wasn't with them. It was with a system that had been corrupted by individuals who had forgotten what military service was supposed to represent. By the third week of her undercover assignment, Colonel Martinez had identified a disturbing pattern that went far beyond simple hazing or tough training. What she was witnessing was a systematic campaign designed to drive female recruits out of the service through psychological warfare, administrative sabotage, and deliberate exclusion from the training they needed to succeed. The scheme was sophisticated and carefully orchestrated. It started with the assignment process itself. Female recruits were routinely given tasks that took them away from essential training opportunities. While male recruits attended weapons certification courses, the women were assigned to administrative duties that consisted mainly of filing, data entry, and cleaning. When female recruits requested to make up missed training sessions, they were told that schedules were full and there would be opportunities later that never materialized. Sergeant Williams had perfected a particularly insidious form of psychological manipulation. He would praise female recruits publicly for excelling at traditionally feminine tasks, organization, attention to detail, following instructions, while simultaneously making it clear that these were lesser accomplishments than the real military skills being taught to their male counterparts. Martinez, Excellent work on those supply inventories, he announced during one morning formation. You women really do have a gift for the detail-oriented stuff. Too bad we can't run a military on filing systems alone. The comment drew snickers from some of the male recruits and left the female recruits feeling simultaneously praised and dismissed. It was a masterclass in backhanded compliments that reinforced gender stereotypes while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. But the psychological tactics were only part of the strategy. Martinez discovered that female recruits were also being systematically failed on evaluations through criteria that were applied inconsistently. A male recruit who completed a physical fitness test in 14 minutes would be marked as meeting standards, while a female recruit who completed the same test in 13 minutes would be told she needed improvement in attitude or military bearing, subjective categories that could be used to justify any grade. The administrative sabotage was equally concerning. Female recruits found their paperwork mysteriously lost or misfiled at crucial moments. Medical appointments were scheduled during mandatory training sessions, forcing them to choose between their health and their military requirements. Equipment requests were delayed or denied, leaving women to train with gear that didn't fit properly or wasn't appropriate for their assigned tasks. Martinez watched as Jennifer Park, the engineering graduate, was repeatedly assigned defective equipment during technical training exercises. When Park's rifle jammed during a marksmanship test, she was marked as failing to maintain her weapon properly, even though Martinez could clearly see that the rifle had a manufacturing defect that would have caused problems for anyone using it. Maybe you should stick to less complicated equipment, Sergeant Morrison suggested with mock concern. Some people just aren't mechanically inclined. The comment was particularly galling because Park had more technical education than anyone in the unit, including most of the instructors. But in the upside-down world of Fort Braxton, competence was being systematically undermined and reframed as inadequacy. The most heartbreaking aspect of the situation was watching how the constant psychological pressure was affecting the recruits' relationships with each other. The female recruits, who had initially formed a supportive network to help each other through the challenges of military training, began to turn on each other as the stress intensified. When Sarah Rodriguez received a rare commendation for her performance during a navigation exercise, some of the other women began to whisper that she must be receiving special treatment. When Lisa Chen was selected for an advanced training opportunity that others had been denied, tensions erupted into open conflict within the female barracks. It's just like they want, Martinez wrote in her encrypted journal. They're creating an environment where the victims turn against each other instead of recognizing the system that's victimizing them all. The isolation was deliberate and effective. Female recruits who might have banded together to challenge unfair treatment found themselves competing against each other for the few opportunities that were made available to them. They began to internalize the message that there was something wrong with them, rather than recognizing that they were being subjected to treatment that had nothing to do with military standards and everything to do with driving them out of service. Martinez also identified the key players in the systematic discrimination. Staff Sergeant Williams was clearly the point person, but he wasn't acting alone. Sergeant First Class Morrison provided administrative cover, ensuring that complaints were buried or dismissed. Captain Bradley, the company commander, maintained plausible deniability by staying removed from day-to-day operations while creating policies that enabled the discrimination to continue.
The chain of accountability went higher than Martinez had initially suspected. Major Collins, the battalion executive officer, had to be aware of the patterns in training completion rates, the disproportionate number of female recruits requesting transfers, and the consistently negative evaluation scores for women in the program. Yet nothing was being done to address these obvious red flags. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that this wasn't an isolated problem. Through carefully casual conversations with personnel from other units, Martinez learned that similar patterns existed throughout the base. Female service members at all levels reported feeling unwelcome, unsupported, and systematically excluded from opportunities for advancement. The scope of the problem was much larger than anyone had realized. This wasn't just about basic training or a few bad actors. This was about an institutional culture that had been allowed to develop and flourish despite decades of military policies designed to ensure equal treatment and opportunity. As Martinez prepared her preliminary reports for her Pentagon contacts, she knew that what she had discovered would require a response that went beyond simple disciplinary action. The rot went deep, and removing it would require a fundamental restructuring of leadership and accountability at Fort Braxton.
Week 4 brought an escalation that even Colonel Martinez hadn't anticipated. The systematic harassment was entering a new phase, one that moved beyond psychological warfare into territory that bordered on outright abuse. It started with an incident that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so deliberately malicious. During a routine equipment inspection, Staff Sergeant Williams announced that several female recruits, including Martinez, had failed to properly maintain their gear. The accusation was absurd. Martinez had been maintaining military equipment for longer than Williams had been alive, but she had to stand silently as he berated her for unprofessional standards. "This is exactly why some people don't belong in the military," Williams declared, holding up Martinez's perfectly maintained rifle for the entire company to see. "If you can't be trusted with basic equipment care, how can you be trusted in combat?" The rifle was spotless, properly oiled, and in better condition than most of the weapons in the armory. But that wasn't the point. The point was public humiliation, and in that regard, Williams had succeeded perfectly. Martinez watched as several of the younger female recruits internalized the message, beginning to doubt their own abilities, despite clear evidence that the standards were being applied unfairly. The punishment for the alleged equipment failures was predictably demeaning. Additional cleaning duties, extended training hours that conflicted with scheduled rest periods, and exclusion from an upcoming field exercise that was crucial for meeting basic training requirements. "Since you ladies can't handle the basic responsibilities," Williams announced, "you'll be staying behind to clean the barracks while the real soldiers get some field experience." It was a masterful double bind. The female recruits were being excluded from training they needed to succeed, then would inevitably be criticized for not having the experience that they were being prevented from gaining. Martinez recognized it as a classic abuse tactic, creating impossible situations that guaranteed failure, then using that failure to justify further mistreatment. But it was Sarah Rodriguez who reached her breaking point first. The 19-year-old from Texas had been systematically ground down over 4 weeks of constant criticism, impossible standards, and deliberate sabotage of her efforts to excel. During what should have been a routine physical fitness assessment, she collapsed not from exhaustion, but from the accumulated weight of psychological pressure. "I can't do it anymore," she sobbed as Martinez and Lisa Chen helped her to the medical station. "I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't belong here." Martinez's heart broke as she listened to this remarkable young woman who had scored in the top percentiles on every test she had been allowed to take declare herself a failure.
This was exactly what the system at Fort Braxton was designed to achieve, taking capable, motivated women and convincing them that their inadequacy, rather than systematic discrimination, was the source of their struggles. The medical incident provided Martinez with a crucial piece of intelligence. As she sat with Rodriguez in the waiting area of the base clinic, she overheard a conversation between two staff members that revealed the true scope of what was happening. "Another one down," said a voice she recognized as belonging to Sergeant Morrison. "That makes, what, 6 this month? Williams has it down to a science. Give it another week and she'll be putting in for a transfer or just washing out completely. The captain will be pleased. He's got money riding on clearing out the female recruits before the end of basic." Martinez felt a chill run down her spine. They were talking about deliberate campaigns to drive out specific individuals with apparent command knowledge and approval. This wasn't just discrimination. It was a coordinated effort to manipulate the system to achieve desired outcomes, regardless of the impact on the victims or the military's actual needs. The betting pool revelation added a particularly sickening dimension to what she had been witnessing. These weren't just prejudiced individuals acting on personal bias. They were turning the systematic destruction of military careers into entertainment, placing wagers on which young women would break first under the pressure they were deliberately applying. That evening, Martinez made her most difficult entry yet into her encrypted journal. She had documented clear evidence of systematic discrimination, psychological abuse, and what appeared to be a conspiracy involving multiple levels of leadership. The question was no longer whether crimes were being committed, it was how high up the chain of command the corruption extended, and how many careers had already been destroyed by these practices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning brought another escalation. Jennifer Park, the engineering graduate who had been consistently undermined despite her obvious competence, was called into a meeting with Captain Bradley. She emerged an hour later in tears, carrying transfer paperwork that would reassign her to a non-combat administrative position at a base 3 states away. "They said I showed promise for desk work," Jennifer Park told Martinez during lunch, her voice hollow with defeat. "Apparently, my talents would be better utilized in logistics and supply management." Martinez knew exactly what had happened. Park's technical skills and engineering background made her too valuable to simply drive out of the service entirely, but they couldn't risk having her succeed in a combat role that would undermine their narrative about female capabilities. So they were transferring her to a position where her talents would be wasted and her potential would never be realized. It was a perfect example of the institutional sexism that Martinez had been sent to investigate. Rather than losing a valuable service member entirely, they would shuffle her into a role that matched their preconceived notions about what women could and should do in the military, regardless of her actual abilities or preferences. The systematic nature of these transfers was becoming clear. Martinez had tracked similar moves involving at least 8 female recruits over the past month. Women who showed aptitude for combat roles were steered toward administrative positions. Those who demonstrated leadership potential were assigned to support functions. Those who refused to accept diminished roles were subjected to increasingly intense pressure until they requested transfers or left the service entirely. The genius of the system was its plausible deniability. On paper, women were being offered positions that matched their interests and aptitudes. In reality, they were being systematically excluded from the roles they had enlisted to fill and steered toward positions that reinforced traditional gender limitations.
As Martinez entered her 5th week undercover, she realized that what she had uncovered was far more sophisticated than a simple case of discrimination by a few rogue personnel. This was an institutional system that had been refined over time, with procedures and protocols designed to achieve discriminatory outcomes while maintaining legal cover.
Her investigation had expanded beyond basic training to encompass the entire base operation. Through careful observation and strategic conversations, she had mapped out a network of complicit personnel that included not just the obvious perpetrators like Staff Sergeant Williams, but also administrative personnel, medical staff, and officers at multiple command levels. The medical component was particularly disturbing. Martinez had documented cases where female personnel reporting harassment or discrimination were subjected to psychological evaluations that questioned their fitness for duty. The base psychologist, Dr. Richard Stern, seemed particularly skilled at finding reasons to recommend administrative separations for women who complained about their treatment. "She's showing signs of adjustment disorder," Martinez overheard Dr. Stern telling Captain Bradley about a female recruit who had filed a complaint about sexual harassment. "Classic inability to adapt to military structure. I'm recommending immediate separation for psychological unfitness." The recruit in question was Maria Santos, a former police officer with 8 years of law enforcement experience who had enlisted to transition into military criminal investigation work. Her adjustment disorder consisted entirely of refusing to accept being groped by a male instructor and having the courage to report it through official channels. Martinez watched as Santos was processed out of the military within 72 hours of filing her complaint, her career dreams destroyed, and her service record permanently marked with a psychological discharge that would follow her for the rest of her life. The speed and efficiency of the process revealed just how well practiced the base had become at eliminating problem personnel. The financial incentives behind the discrimination were becoming clearer as well. Martinez discovered that base commanders received performance bonuses based on training completion rates and cost per graduate. By systematically driving out female recruits early in the process, they were improving their statistics while reducing training costs. The fact that they were destroying careers and wasting taxpayer investment in recruiting was apparently irrelevant compared to the immediate financial benefits to the command structure. Captain Bradley's office had become a focal point of Martinez's investigation. Through careful positioning during her cleaning duties, she had been able to observe multiple meetings where the systematic exclusion of female personnel was discussed as a matter of routine base management. "The numbers look good for this quarter," she heard Bradley telling Major Collins during one such meeting. "We're running about 15% ahead of last year's efficiency ratings." "And the complaint rate?" Collins asked. "Down significantly. The new protocols are working exactly as intended. Most of the problems are transferring out or separating before they can cause issues." The casual nature of their conversation about destroying military careers was chilling. These officers were discussing the systematic exclusion of qualified personnel as though it were a routine business decision, showing no awareness or concern for the individual lives they were impacting or the broader damage they were doing to military readiness and effectiveness. Martinez had also identified the international implications of what was happening at Fort Braxton. Several of the affected personnel were specialists in critical areas like cybersecurity, engineering, and intelligence analysis, fields where the military was already facing serious recruitment and retention challenges. By driving out qualified women in these specialties, the base was contributing to national security vulnerabilities that extended far beyond their local command. The pattern extended to career personnel as well. Martinez had documented cases of experienced female NCOs and junior officers who had been subjected to similar treatment, though the tactics were more sophisticated at higher ranks. Rather than overt harassment, they faced exclusion from key assignments, negative fitness reports based on subjective criteria, and systematic undermining of their authority with subordinates. Sergeant First Class Linda Walsh, a 12-year veteran with an exemplary service record, had been denied 3 separate applications for advanced training schools despite meeting all qualification requirements. When she asked for feedback on her applications, she was told that while she was technically qualified, the selection boards were looking for candidates with stronger leadership presence and better command potential. It's like they have a completely different set of standards for us. Everything we do gets explained away. If we're successful, it's because the task was easy or we had help. If we struggle, it's proof that we don't belong. There's literally no way to win. Martinez recognized the psychological trap that Walsh was describing. It was a classic double-bind where success was dismissed and failure was highlighted, creating a narrative that justified predetermined conclusions about female capabilities regardless of actual performance. The scope of the investigation had grown beyond what Martinez had originally anticipated. She was no longer just documenting discrimination against basic trainees, she was uncovering an institutional culture that systematically devalued and excluded women at all levels of military service. The implications for military readiness, legal liability, and the fundamental principles of equal opportunity in federal service were staggering. Her secure communications with Pentagon leadership had taken on increased urgency. The evidence she was gathering suggested violations of federal law, military regulations, and constitutional principles of equal protection. The question was no longer whether action was needed, it was how extensive that action would need to be to address a problem that had clearly been allowed to metastasize over years of institutional neglect.
Week 6 brought an unexpected development that would accelerate everything Martinez had been working toward. The base was scheduled to receive a high-level inspection from Pentagon leadership. Not the routine announced visits that allowed for careful preparation and concealment, but a surprise evaluation that was part of a new initiative to assess military readiness and training effectiveness across all installations. The announcement came during morning formation, delivered by Major Collins with barely concealed anxiety. We will be receiving distinguished visitors next week for a comprehensive assessment of our training programs and base operations. All personnel are expected to maintain the highest standards of military bearing and professionalism. Martinez felt a surge of anticipation mixed with concern. This could be the opportunity she had been waiting for. A chance to expose what was happening at Fort Braxton to senior leadership who had the authority to take immediate action. But it also meant that her undercover mission was about to become exponentially more dangerous. The base leadership went into overdrive preparing for the inspection. Suddenly, the obvious signs of discrimination and poor treatment were being hastily addressed. The women's barracks received emergency repairs that had been pending for months. Female personnel who had been excluded from training opportunities were suddenly scheduled for makeup sessions. Equipment that had been mysteriously unavailable was located and distributed. Amazing how things get fixed when the brass is coming, Lisa Chen observed as maintenance crews worked around the clock to address problems that had been ignored for months. Think they'll figure out what's really been going on here? Martinez knew that temporary cosmetic changes wouldn't hide the systematic patterns she had documented over 6 weeks of careful observation. The evidence was in the paperwork, the personnel records, the documented incidents, and most importantly, in the testimony of the women who had been subjected to months of psychological warfare disguised as military training. But she also knew that senior military leaders on inspection tours often saw only what their hosts wanted them to see. The challenge would be finding a way to ensure that the reality of Fort Braxton was exposed, rather than the carefully constructed facade that would be presented to the visiting officials. The preparation for the inspection revealed another disturbing aspect of the systematic discrimination, the extent to which it had been normalized throughout the base. Personnel at all levels seemed to understand instinctively what needed to be hidden and what needed to be emphasized. The cover-up was so smooth and automatic that it was clear this wasn't the first time they had concealed their practices from outside scrutiny. Staff Sergeant Williams conducted special briefings with all personnel, ostensibly about maintaining professional standards during the inspection, but his real message was clear. Anyone who made the base look bad would face serious consequences. I trust everyone understands the importance of presenting Fort Braxton in the best possible light. Visitors sometimes get the wrong impression if they don't understand our training methods and standards. I'm sure no one wants to be responsible for creating unnecessary complications. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Personnel who spoke out about problems would be identified and dealt with after the inspection team left. It was a masterful example of how institutional abuse perpetuated itself through fear and intimidation. Martinez realized that she was at a crucial decision point. She could continue her undercover investigation, gathering more evidence while the problems were temporarily suppressed during the inspection. Or she could find a way to expose what she had discovered to the visiting officials, knowing that doing so would end her mission, but potentially save the careers and lives of the women who were being systematically victimized. The decision was made for her when she learned the identity of the senior official leading the inspection team,
General Patricia Hayes, the five-star general who had originally authorized Operation Mirror and sent Martinez undercover. General Hayes was one of the few people who knew Martinez's real identity and the true purpose of her presence at Fort Braxton. The irony was almost overwhelming. Martinez had been scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, and enduring weeks of systematic harassment while preparing to brief the very general who would be arriving to assess the base's operations. The collision between her undercover identity and her real status was about to create a situation that nobody had anticipated. General Hayes was scheduled to arrive on a Tuesday morning for a 3-day comprehensive evaluation. Her itinerary included tours of training facilities, meetings with base leadership, and informal interactions with personnel at all levels. Protocol demanded that she be briefed on all ongoing operations and investigations, which would presumably include Operation Mirror, though the base leadership had no knowledge of Martinez's true role. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just the systematic discrimination at Fort Braxton, but also the lengths to which Martinez had gone to document it. Her weeks of careful documentation, systematic evidence gathering, and personal sacrifice were about to culminate in a moment that would either validate everything she had endured or put her in an impossibly compromised position. As she prepared for what might be her final days undercover, Martinez reflected on what she had learned about institutional abuse and the courage required to confront it. The young women she had served alongside had shown remarkable strength in the face of systematic attempts to break their spirits. They deserved better than the treatment they had received, and they deserved to know that their struggles had not been invisible or ignored. The approaching inspection would determine whether their sacrifices had meaning, and whether the system that had failed them so badly could be reformed or would simply continue operating under a thin veneer of respectability.
Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear at Fort Braxton, but the atmosphere on base was electric with tension. General Patricia Hayes was scheduled to arrive at 0900 hours for what everyone understood would be the most important inspection in the base's recent history. Every surface had been polished, every uniform pressed to perfection, and every potential problem either fixed or carefully hidden. Colonel Martinez, still maintaining her cover as Recruit Martinez, found herself assigned to a cleaning detail that would keep her well away from the official proceedings. Star Sergeant Williams had made it clear that certain personnel would be maintaining operational security by performing essential duties in areas where they wouldn't accidentally encounter the visiting dignitaries. Martinez, Rodriguez, Chen, you'll be on special detail today. Deep cleaning of the administrative building. I want every floor mopped, every window spotless, and every surface sanitized. This is not a day for any of you to be wandering around where you don't belong. The message was unmistakable. The female recruits who had been most vocal about their treatment, most persistent in their complaints, and most visible in their struggles were being sequestered away from any possibility of contact with the inspection team. It was a masterful final insult, being relegated to janitorial duties while their real soldiers participated in the inspection that would determine the base's future. Martinez felt the bitter irony of the situation as she gathered her cleaning supplies. Here she was, one of the most decorated officers in the United States Army, being ordered to mop floors by a star sergeant who had no idea that she outranked him by several levels and had more combat experience than most of the base leadership combined. But the assignment also presented an opportunity. The administrative building housed the offices where the real decisions were made, where the paperwork that documented the systematic discrimination was stored, and where the inspection team would be conducting many of their private meetings. If she could position herself correctly, she might be able to observe or overhear crucial conversations that would provide additional evidence for her investigation. At 0847 hours, the sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of General Hayes and her inspection team. Through the windows of the administrative building, Martinez could see the carefully choreographed reception that had been prepared. Base leadership stood in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing textbook military bearing. It was a beautiful facade that concealed the rot beneath. General Hayes stepped out of the helicopter with the bearing that had made her a legend in military circles and in the halls of the Pentagon. She was accompanied by a team of senior officers, each of whom represented different aspects of military operations and oversight.
As Martinez continued her assigned cleaning duties, she watched the initial reception play out according to script. Major Collins delivered what appeared to be a perfectly professional briefing. Captain Bradley presented his reports with confidence. The visiting team was escorted through a series of carefully selected facilities that showcased the base's capabilities while avoiding any areas where problems might be visible. The performance was flawless, and Martinez felt a growing sense of despair as she realized how easily the systematic abuse she had documented could remain hidden beneath this veneer of military professionalism. Unless something unexpected happened, General Hayes would leave Fort Braxton with the impression that it was a well-run installation with minor areas for improvement, rather than a facility where careers were being systematically destroyed and federal law was routinely violated. The morning progressed with clockwork precision. Martinez moved through the administrative building. Her mop and bucket provided perfect camouflage as she positioned herself near doorways and conference rooms where conversations were taking place. Most of what she overheard was routine briefing material, statistics about training completion rates, budget allocations, personnel assignments, and operational readiness assessments. But she also heard the careful omissions and strategic misdirections that painted a completely false picture of life at Fort Braxton. When asked about personnel retention rates, Major Collins spoke about natural attrition and career transitions without mentioning the systematic campaigns to drive out female personnel. When questioned about equal opportunity programs, Captain Bradley highlighted the base's formal compliance with regulations while ignoring the reality of how those regulations were being circumvented. The most infuriating moment came when Dr. Stern, the base psychologist, briefed the inspection team on support services for personnel experiencing adjustment challenges. He spoke eloquently about the base's commitment to helping service members overcome difficulties and find appropriate career paths, making his systematic use of psychological evaluations to eliminate complaint makers sound like compassionate personnel management. At 11:30 hours, Martinez overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. General Hayes was asking about specific cases of personnel separations and transfers, requesting to review documentation for patterns that might indicate systemic issues. Major Collins assured her that all such cases were handled according to regulations, and that the documentation would demonstrate appropriate procedures and justifications. "We take pride in our thorough approach to personnel management," Collins said smoothly. "Every separation is carefully documented and reviewed to ensure we're making decisions that serve both the individual and the military's needs." Martinez knew exactly what documentation they would present: carefully sanitized files that showed the symptoms of systematic discrimination without revealing the underlying causes. The visiting team would see the high rate of female separations as evidence of successful counseling and appropriate career guidance rather than the result of psychological warfare designed to force departures. As the morning wore on, Martinez realized that her carefully gathered evidence meant nothing if it remained hidden in encrypted files that would never be examined. The inspection was proceeding exactly as the base leadership had planned, and without some form of dramatic intervention, the systematic abuse would continue indefinitely, protected by official reports that praised Fort Braxton's efficiency and professionalism. The moment of truth was approaching, and Martinez faced the most difficult decision of her military career.
At 12:45 hours, Martinez's careful planning collided with an unexpected reality that would change everything. General Hayes had requested an impromptu walkthrough of the administrative building, wanting to see the day-to-day operations without the formal escort that had characterized the morning's events. Her aide-de-camp had protested that it wasn't on the schedule, but General Hayes was known for her preference for unscripted observations that revealed more than formal presentations. Martinez was in the main corridor, methodically mopping the floor near the conference room where much of the morning's briefings had taken place, when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see General Hayes walking toward her, accompanied only by a single aide, and moving with the purposeful stride that had become her trademark. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two women looked at each other. Martinez saw recognition flicker in General Hayes's eyes, the unmistakable moment when the general realized that the recruit mopping floors in front of her was actually Colonel Rebecca Martinez, one of the most decorated officers in the Army and the agent she had personally selected for Operation Mirror. General Hayes stopped walking. Her aide, confused by the sudden halt, looked between the general and the recruit who had somehow captured her complete attention. Other base personnel in the corridor also paused, sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to understand what. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was actually only seconds. Martinez stood frozen, her mop in hand, still wearing the simple uniform of a basic trainee. General Hayes stood equally still, her face showing no emotion, but her eyes reflecting the rapid calculations of a brilliant military mind processing an impossible situation. Then, slowly and deliberately, General Patricia Hayes came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to the woman standing before her with a mop in her hands. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every person in the corridor stopped what they were doing and stared in shock. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been approaching to ensure that the general wasn't being bothered by cleaning personnel, froze mid-step with his mouth open. The aide-de-camp looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Several other base personnel who had witnessed the exchange began whispering frantically among themselves. Martinez felt time slow to a crawl as she processed what had just happened. General Hayes had blown her cover in the most dramatic and public way possible, but she had also made a statement that could not be misunderstood or ignored. By saluting Martinez in front of witnesses, she had declared that the woman they had been treating as a lowly recruit was someone deserving of the highest military respect. Without breaking eye contact with General Hayes, Martinez set down her mop, came to attention, and returned the salute with the crisp precision of an officer with 35 years of military service. It was a moment that revealed everything about who she really was. The bearing, the precision, the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded respect in the most challenging environments the military could offer. Staff Sergeant Williams found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than a command. "Recruit Martinez! What the hell do you think you're doing? You don't salute—" "Staff Sergeant Williams," General Hayes interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had silenced rooms full of generals and politicians. "Colonel Martinez, I believe you may want to reconsider how you address Colonel Martinez." The words hit the assembled personnel like a physical blow. Colonel Martinez, not Recruit Martinez, not some confused older woman who thought she could play soldier, but Colonel Martinez, an officer who outranked everyone on the base except for the commanding general himself. Williams' face went through a series of color changes as the implications sank in. Captain Bradley, who had arrived just in time to witness the salute exchange, looked as though he might be physically ill. Major Collins, summoned by the commotion, appeared at the end of the corridor and immediately understood that whatever carefully constructed narrative he had been building for the inspection had just collapsed entirely. "Colonel Martinez," General Hayes said formally, "I believe we need to discuss your observations regarding the training protocols and personnel management practices at this installation." Martinez nodded, her voice steady despite the enormity of what had just occurred. "Yes, ma'am. I have extensive documentation that I believe will be of interest to the inspection team." The formal military language couldn't disguise the earthquake that had just struck Fort Braxton. In the space of a single salute, the entire command structure had been revealed as having systematically abused, harassed, and discriminated against an officer whose service record commanded respect throughout the military. Every order they had given her, every demeaning task they had assigned her, every moment of deliberate humiliation was now revealed in its true light. But more than that, the public nature of the revelation meant that there could be no quiet cover-up, no administrative solution that allowed everyone to save face.
Too many people had witnessed the exchange, and too many questions would now be asked about how a colonel had ended up scrubbing floors while being systematically harassed by personnel who should have been showing her the respect due to her rank and service. General Hayes turned to address the assembled personnel, her voice carrying easily through the corridor. "I believe this installation has some significant explaining to do. Colonel Martinez has been conducting an authorized investigation into training protocols and personnel management practices. Her findings will be reviewed immediately." The investigation that Martinez had been conducting in secret for 6 weeks was now officially and publicly acknowledged. There would be no more hiding behind plausible deniability, no more claims of misunderstanding or isolated incidents. The systematic discrimination she had documented was about to face the full scrutiny of Pentagon-level oversight, and everyone involved knew that careers were about to end.
The emergency meeting convened in the base commander's conference room 30 minutes after the corridor confrontation was unlike anything Fort Braxton had ever experienced. Colonel Martinez sat at the table in her recruit uniform, but her bearing and demeanor now unmistakably reflected her true rank and authority. General Hayes occupied the head of the table, flanked by her inspection team members who were rapidly taking notes as the scope of Operation Mirror was explained. Major Collins, Captain Bradley, Staff Sergeant Williams, and Dr. Stern sat on the opposite side of the table, their faces reflecting various stages of shock, panic, and dawning comprehension of their situation. The base commanding general, Colonel Thompson, had been summoned from an off-base meeting and arrived to find his installation in complete crisis. "Colonel Martinez," General Hayes began formally, "please brief the assembled personnel on your findings during Operation Mirror." Martinez opened her encrypted tablet and began what would become one of the most damning reports in recent military history. For the next 2 hours, she methodically documented the systematic discrimination, psychological abuse, administrative sabotage, and deliberate exclusion of female personnel that she had witnessed and experienced firsthand. She presented evidence of betting pools on which female recruits would be driven out first. She detailed the systematic assignment of defective equipment to women during critical evaluations. She documented the use of psychological evaluations as weapons against personnel who filed complaints. She revealed the financial incentives that encouraged commanders to manipulate completion statistics by driving out female recruits early in the training process. The discrimination is not isolated incidents or individual bias, Martinez concluded. It is a systematic, institutionalized practice that involves personnel at multiple levels and has been refined over time to achieve maximum effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability. The silence that followed her presentation was broken only by the sound of furious note-taking from the inspection team. General Hayes looked at each of the accused personnel in turn, her expression reflecting the controlled fury of a leader who had discovered that her institution was being corrupted from within. "General Collins, you have been briefed on federal equal opportunity laws, military regulations regarding discrimination, and the legal requirements for fair treatment of all personnel. How do you explain these systematic violations under your command?" Collins's response was a masterclass in deflection and denial. He claimed ignorance of the specific incidents Martinez had described. He suggested that there might have been misunderstandings or isolated cases of poor judgment. He emphasized his commitment to equal opportunity and his surprise at learning about any problems. "General, I can assure you that this command has always maintained the highest standards of professionalism and equal treatment. If there have been isolated incidents of inappropriate behavior, we are committed to addressing them immediately through proper channels." General Hayes' response was swift and devastating. "Major Collins, you are describing isolated incidents. Colonel Martinez has documented systematic patterns involving multiple personnel over extended periods. This is not poor judgment. This is institutional failure at the most basic level." Captain Bradley attempted a similar strategy, claiming that any problems were the result of overzealous subordinates acting without his knowledge or approval. He portrayed himself as a victim of poor communication rather than an architect of systematic abuse. Dr. Stern took a different approach, trying to reframe the psychological evaluations as legitimate medical assessments of personnel who were genuinely struggling with military life. He claimed that his recommendations were based on objective criteria and were intended to help individuals find appropriate career paths. General, I want to emphasize that every evaluation I conducted was based on established psychological principles and was intended to serve the best interests of both the individual and the military. If my assessments have been mischaracterized, I'm happy to provide detailed explanations of my methodology. Staff Sergeant Williams, perhaps recognizing that his position was completely indefensible, chose to remain silent rather than attempt explanations that would only make his situation worse. General Hayes turned to Colonel Thompson, who had been conspicuously quiet throughout the briefings. Colonel Thompson, as commanding officer of this installation, you bear ultimate responsibility for the culture and practices that have developed here. What is your response to these findings? Thompson's reply revealed the depth of the institutional failure. He claimed to have been unaware of the specific practices Martinez had documented, despite their systematic nature and extended duration. He suggested that the problems were confined to specific units and did not reflect the overall culture of the base. He proposed immediate corrective actions and promised full cooperation with any further investigations. General, I am as shocked as anyone by these allegations. This command has always prided itself on maintaining the highest standards of military professionalism. If there have been failures of oversight or communication, I take full responsibility and am committed to implementing whatever changes are necessary to ensure this never happens again. But General Hayes had heard enough deflection and denial. Her response cut through the careful language and addressed the reality of what had been revealed. Gentlemen, you are missing the fundamental point. This is not about isolated incidents or communication failures. This is about the systematic violation of federal law, military regulations, and basic human decency. Colonel Martinez has provided documentation that would support criminal charges against multiple personnel at this installation. The room fell silent as the full implications of the situation became clear. This wasn't going to be resolved with counseling, retraining, or administrative actions. Criminal violations had occurred, careers were going to be destroyed, and the entire command structure of Fort Braxton was about to be dismantled. General Hayes continued, effective immediately, this installation is under Pentagon oversight pending a complete investigation. All personnel involved in the documented incidents are suspended from their duties. Colonel Martinez will be working directly with the Inspector General's office to ensure that every aspect of these violations is thoroughly investigated and prosecuted to the full extent of military and civilian law.
6 months after that dramatic salute in the corridor of Fort Braxton's administrative building, the transformation of the installation was complete. What had begun as Operation Mirror, a covert investigation into reports of discrimination, had evolved into one of the most comprehensive military justice actions in recent Army history. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Staff Sergeant Williams faced court-martial for systematic harassment, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to violate federal equal opportunity laws. His conviction resulted in reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from the service with a dishonorable discharge. The betting pools he had organized were deemed particularly egregious, adding criminal gambling charges to his list of convictions. Captain Bradley and Major Collins faced similar court-martial proceedings for their roles in enabling and participating in the systematic discrimination. Both were convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of military authority, abuse of their positions, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Their military careers ended in disgrace with dismissals, forfeitures, and permanent bars from future federal employment. Dr. Stern faced the most complex legal proceedings as his actions involved both military justice and civilian medical ethics violations. The military convicted him of conspiracy and abuse of authority, while the state medical board revoked his license for using psychological evaluations as weapons against patients who had sought help. His professional reputation was destroyed, and he faced significant civil liability for the careers he had helped destroy. Colonel Thompson, as installation commander, faced the harshest judgment of all. His court-martial conviction for failure to maintain command discipline and willful ignorance of systematic violations under his authority resulted in dismissal, forfeiture of retirement benefits, and a federal conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life. But the legal proceedings were only part of the transformation. The Pentagon had used Fort Braxton as a test case for implementing new oversight protocols, training programs, and cultural reforms throughout the military. General Hayes personally oversaw the installation of new leadership, the implementation of independent oversight mechanisms, and the development of training programs that would be rolled out Army-wide. Colonel Martinez had been promoted to Brigadier General in recognition of her extraordinary service during Operation Mirror.
mirror. Her willingness to endure weeks of systematic harassment and humiliation in order to expose institutional corruption had made her a symbol of the military's commitment to real reform rather than cosmetic changes. The young women whose careers had been saved by Martinez's investigation had become powerful advocates for reform throughout the military. Sarah Rodriguez, who had nearly broken under the psychological pressure at Fort Braxton, completed her military training with honors and was accepted into an elite special operations program. Jennifer Park used her engineering expertise to help design new training protocols that eliminated opportunities for discriminatory treatment. Lisa Chen became a military police officer specializing in investigating discrimination and harassment cases. Maria Santos, the former police officer who had been railroaded out of the service for reporting sexual harassment, was reinstated with full rank and benefits. She sued the federal government for wrongful termination and used her settlement to establish a foundation that provided legal support for military personnel facing discrimination. The impact of the Fort Braxton investigation extended far beyond a single installation. Congressional hearings led to new legislation strengthening oversight of military training programs. The Department of Defense implemented mandatory bias training for all personnel in leadership positions. Independent ombudsman offices were established at major installations to provide confidential reporting mechanisms for discrimination and harassment. Most importantly, the cultural change was real and measurable. Follow-up investigations at other installations revealed that the Fort Braxton case had sent a clear message throughout the military. Systematic discrimination would not be tolerated, covered up, or ignored. Personnel who had previously felt powerless to report problems found new courage, knowing that their complaints would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The documentary film about Operation Mirror, featuring extensive interviews with General Martinez and the women whose careers she had saved, became a powerful tool for training and cultural change throughout the military. The image of a five-star general saluting a woman with a mop in her hands became an iconic representation of the principle that respect and dignity should be based on character and service rather than rank or gender. General Hayes used the Fort Braxton case to support broader reforms throughout the military justice system. Her advocacy led to new policies requiring independent investigation of discrimination complaints, mandatory reporting of statistical patterns that might indicate systematic problems, and regular unannounced inspections designed to identify cultural issues before they became entrenched. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some personnel resisted the changes, viewing them as political correctness rather than necessary reforms. Some installations struggled to implement new protocols effectively. Some cases fell through the cracks in the system, requiring additional oversight and intervention. But the fundamental message of Operation Mirror had been delivered clearly and decisively. The United States military would not tolerate the systematic exclusion or mistreatment of qualified personnel based on gender, race, or any other protected characteristic. The institution that had failed so many women at Fort Braxton had been held accountable, reformed, and transformed into something better. General Martinez often reflected on the irony that some of her most important military service had been performed while scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets. Her willingness to sacrifice her dignity temporarily had preserved the dignity and careers of countless others who would never know her name but would benefit from the system she had helped create. The story of Operation Mirror became a reminder that true military leadership sometimes required serving in the most humble capacities, that justice sometimes demanded personal sacrifice, and that the strength of an institution was measured not by its ability to maintain appearances, but by its willingness to confront and correct its own failures. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.